Everybody on that ranch had a name for him before they had a word with him. We called him the Apache, the way you'd call a dog the gray one. Not cruel, just lazy. The laziness of men who don't expect a stranger to be around long enough to be worth the trouble of learning. We watched him walk the ridgelands at dusk with a sack over his shoulder, watched him disappear into rock where there wasn't supposed to be any place to disappear to. And we decided, the way men do, that a man who hides things is a man who is hiding something from you. We were wrong about almost all of it. I want to say that plainly, up front, because the rest of this is going to make me look better than I deserve, and I have lived too long to let a story flatter me. What I'm telling you happened the winter the snow came in 3 days early and stayed 41 days late. The winter that buried the Callaway place to the eaves and killed every cow that wasn't already dead, and most of the men who went looking for the ones that were. I have written it all down because I keep a ledger of everything. Debts, weather, the names of horses, the day my wife stopped speaking to the parlor wall and started speaking to me again. And because some things you have to write down or your own mind will sand the edges off them until they're smooth enough to forget. This is the truth of a man who dug a hole in a mountain, and how that hole kept 11 of us breathing, while God did his level best to put us under the ground. The wind came first, the way it always does, except this time it came wrong. I knew it was wrong before I knew why. I was 44 years old that winter, and I had spent every one of them in high country, and a man who lives that long against the weather develops a sense in the meat behind his ears. A small animal that wakes up and starts packing before his eyes have anything to report. Mine woke up around 3 in the afternoon while I was forking hay down to the bay mare, and it would not lie back down. The light had gone the color of a healing bruise, not gray. Bruise that sick green-yellow that means the sky is holding something it doesn't want to hold any longer. The cattle had stopped lowing. That was the part that put the cold finger on my spine. Cattle are stupid animals. God loved them, but they are not stupid about dying, and the whole herd had gone quiet and drifted to the low fence in the south pasture and pressed themselves against it like children at a closed door. Hutch, I called down to the boy in the yard. Hutch wasn't his name. His name was Theodore Hutchins, and he was 19, and he hated Theodore worse than he hated work, which was saying something. Hutch, get the others. Get everybody into the main house. And bring the Petersons' young uns, they're playing down by the creek. He looked up at me with that grin he wore when he thought I was being an old woman about the weather. It's just blowin', Cal. It is not just blowin', I said. Move. He moved. I'll give the boy that. He could read a tone even when he couldn't read a sky. By the time I got down the ladder, my hands had gone stiff inside my gloves, and the temperature had dropped so fast I felt it in the fillings of my teeth. The first flakes weren't even soft. They came sideways, small and hard as sand, and they hissed against the barn boards, and I remember standing there in the doorway with the fork still in my hand, thinking a thought I had never thought before in all my years of weather, which was, this is going to be the one that gets some of us. Let me tell you who us was, because it matters. Because every name on this list nearly went into the frozen ground that February. There was me, Calhoun Mercer, owner of 300 acres of grass that was about to be worth nothing, husband to a good woman, father to a girl I'll get to. There was my wife, Adeline, who had buried 2 sons before they were old enough to be called by their full names, and who had come out the other side of that grief with a quietness in her you could mistake for peace if you didn't know better. There was our daughter, Junie, 8 years old, who had a cough that month that I had been telling myself was nothing. There was Hutch, and there were 2 other hands, a Mexican fellow named Tomás who could rope anything that moved and some things that didn't, and an old wreck of a cowboy named Dell whose lungs had been ruined by 40 years of dust, and who shouldn't have been working at all but had nowhere else to be. There were the Petersons, Earl and his wife Margit, who'd lost their own soddy to a fire that autumn and were wintering in our bunkhouse out of pure Christian arithmetic. And their 3 children, the oldest of which was 11 and the youngest of which was still in arms. That's 10. The 11th was the Apache. And I didn't even think of him as one of us, not at the start. That's the shameful little truth at the center of this. When I did my count in the doorway of that barn, my mind ran the rope through 10 head and never once stopped on the man who would be the reason any of us lived to argue about it afterward. I should tell you about him now, before the snow buries the telling. He had come to us in the fall, walking out of the eastern hills on his own 2 feet with a Springfield rifle. He never once pointed at anybody, and a face I could not read for the life of me. He was not young. His hair was iron and his hands were a map of old work, and there was a stillness in him that the men found unnerving, the way a deep pool is unnerving when you can't see the bottom. He wanted work. He said so in English better than half my hands could manage, slow and exact, like a man laying stones. I will work for the winter. I do not need much. And I, being a man who had grass to cut and cattle to mind and a thin enough crew to do it with, took him on, over the objections of exactly everyone. You know what they say about that bunch, Dell told me, the night I hired him hawking into the fire. You'll wake up with your throat opened. They say a lot of things, Dell, I told him. Most of it from men who never met one and the rest of it from men who killed the ones they did. That shut him up, but it didn't change anybody's mind, mine included. I want to be honest about that. I hired the man because I needed the hands, not because I'd reasoned my way to any kind of grace about it. Grace came later, and it came hard, and it came too late to do him any good. His name, I'll give it to you now, because he gave it to me much later and by then it had weight. His name was Esquilte. The hands couldn't say it and didn't try. I heard it once, the right way, from his own mouth, on a night I'll come to, and I have never forgotten the shape of it. The way the middle of it caught in his throat like the name was something he was reaching back for across a long, cold distance. They called him the Apache. I let them. That's a thing I have to carry. What he did that nobody could figure was walk. Not work, he worked. Harder and quieter than men half his age. And he had a way with the horses that made Tamaz jealous and made me wonder what kind of life puts that into a man's hands. But after the work was done, in the blue hour before full dark, when the rest of us were peeling off boots and complaining toward supper, Esquilte would shoulder a sack and walk up into the rocks east of the pasture and not come back for an hour or two. Sometimes the sack looked full when he went and empty when he returned. Sometimes the other way. Once I saw him carrying a bundle of dried meat I knew for a fact he hadn't gotten from our smokehouse, and once I saw him with an armload of split firewood disappearing into a fold of rock that, when I rode up to it the next day, showed me nothing at all but stone and a little juniper, and the kind of silence that makes a man feel watched by the land itself. Naturally, the men decided he was stealing. What else would they decide? Supplies were tight that winter, they always were, but that year worse. And a man who carries things off into the hills and comes back empty-handed is, in the simple grammar of suspicion, a thief. Dell counted the smokehouse hams twice a week and reported the count to me like a man delivering evidence. Hutch took to following him badly, crashing through brush like a yearling moose, and came back swearing the Apache had just vanished into the rock, which only made the men more certain there was deviltry in it. I'll tell you the truth, I half believed them. Not because the evidence was good, it wasn't. The smokehouse hams never came up short, not once, but because believing it was easier. It is always easier to think a stranger is robbing you than to admit you have no idea what is in his heart, and that the not knowing is your failing and not his. One evening in November, I followed him myself. I was better at it than Hutch. Which is to say I was not seen, which is to say I was lucky, because a man like Esquilte is not easily not seen, and I have come to suspect he let me find what I found. I tracked him up through the rocks in the failing light, my heart doing a guilty little gallop, and I watched him stop at a place in the cliff face where a slab of red stone leaned against the mountain like a half-shut door. He moved the juniper aside. There was a gap behind it, narrow as a coffin set on its end, and he turned sideways and went into the mountain, and the light of his small lamp came up gold inside the rock. I crept close enough to see. And what I saw, I did not understand. Not then. I understood it the way you understand a word in a language you don't speak. I could see that it meant something, that it was the patient work of many evenings, but I could not read it. It was a cave, a real one, dry, the mouth of it widening into a chamber maybe 12 feet deep, and it was full. Shelves, actual shelves, cut and wedged into the rock level as a carpenter's bench, held jars and bundles and sacks. Dried meat hung from a juniper pole jammed crossways near the ceiling out of the damp. There was firewood stacked man-high along one wall, split fine and stacked tight. There were skins. There was a heap of what I later learned was dried mescal and seed cakes and pinole, the food of a people who had learned, the hardest way a people can learn it, that the land will turn on you, and that the only answer to a land that turns on you is to put something away against the turning. There were blankets folded, waiting. There was even water, in skins, and in a clay-lined basin he dug into the floor where some seep fed it a drop at a time. I stood outside that coffin slot of an entrance in the dark and the cold, and I felt, God help me, I felt afraid. Because a man does not build a thing like that for a season. A man builds a thing like that the way you build a grave or a church. Against time, against death, against the worst thing he can imagine, which means he has imagined the worst thing, which means somewhere behind him in the dark there is a worse thing he has already lived through. I didn't speak to him. I crept back down the mountain like the coward I was being, and I told no one what I'd seen, and I lay awake that night next to Adeline turning it over and over. He's not stealing, I finally said into the dark. I know, Adeline said, which startled me because I'd thought she was asleep. He's getting ready. For what? She didn't answer for a long time. Then she said the thing that I have thought about every winter since. For what nobody else thinks is coming. Nobody thought it was coming. That's the thing about that winter, the thing the almanacs and the old-timers all got wrong. The fall had been mild. The first snows came late and melted fast. Everyone in the territory, myself included, had let the woodpiles run lower than was wise and the larders run leaner than was smart, because the weather had been gentle and gentleness makes fools of us all. The town store, 40 miles off by the wagon road, had what we needed in it, sure, but 40 miles is 40 miles, and we'd all of us figured on one more easy trip before the hard weather. The way you figure on one more easy anything before the thing that kills you. Escolte had not figured that way. I want you to understand the loneliness of what he did. Every evening, while 10 people who didn't trust him ate the supper his labor had helped to make possible, he climbed alone into the rocks and put away food none of us thought we'd need, against a winter none of us thought was coming, in a place none of us would have found if we'd been buried alive 10 feet from its door. He did it on a hunch in the meat behind his ears, the same animal that woke in mine that afternoon in the barn, except his woke in October, while the grass was still green, and he was the only one of us who listened to it. He did it for himself. I believe that, and I want to say it, because I'm not going to paint the man as some saint who labored in secret out of love for people who scorned him. He built that cave to keep himself alive. He was a man who had learned that no one was coming to save him, and that the only hands he could count on were his own. But here is the thing I have never been able to get past, the thing I turn in my fingers like a smooth stone on the bad nights. When the worst came, and it came, he did not keep that door shut. The storm took the barn roof on the second night. I'm getting ahead of myself, but you should know it. You should know what we were up against, so that when I tell you we'd have died you understand I am not being dramatic. I am being a ledger keeper. I am giving you the count. The first day the snow came sideways and small, and we got everybody into the main house and thought ourselves clever. The second day it came down out of a windless white sky in flakes the size of communion wafers, and it did not stop. It would not stop. And by evening the drifts had climbed the north windows, and the world outside had gone the featureless blind white of the inside of an eggshell. That second night the wind came back, and it came back like something with a grievance, and somewhere in the black middle of it, we heard a long grinding shriek and a crash that shook the lamps. And in the morning the barn was a broken-backed thing half swallowed by a drift, and 3 of my horses were dead under the timbers, and the bay mare was screaming and had to be shot. And I did it myself through a gap in the snow because no one else would, and that is the kind of winter it was. Our woodpile was outside. I have to tell you that flat because it was the flat fact that broke us. The woodpile, the great woodpile, the one we'd let run a little low but that should have lasted, was stacked along the south wall of the barn, and when the barn came down the snow came with it, and by the third day that wood was under 9 feet of pack as hard as church marble, and there was no getting at it, not with shovels, not with prayer. We had what was in the house, a day's worth. Maybe 2, if we let the place go cold enough to see our breath, which we did. The food was the same arithmetic. We had the kitchen stores, which were a kitchen's worth: flour, some beans, a side of bacon, the makings of maybe 4 days of thin meals for 11 people, and one of those 11 a baby and another a child with a cough that had stopped being something I could tell myself was nothing. Junie's cough. I want to tell you about Junie's cough, but I find that even now, even in a ledger, even all these years on, my hand does not want to write it down. So I'll just say this much and no more for now. By the third night of the storm my daughter was burning under 3 blankets in the cold front room, and her breath had taken on a sound I knew, a wet rattling pull I had heard twice before in my life, both times in the chests of sons I do not have any more. Adeline sat by her and did not weep. She had wept herself empty years before. She just held the child's hand and watched the door, watched it the way a woman watches a road she knows no one is coming down. And I stood in my own kitchen, the owner of 300 acres, a husband and a father and a man who had counted himself capable his whole life, and I understood that I could not save any of them. No wood, no way to town, no way to even get warm enough to fight the fever in my girl's chest. The whole white world had closed its fist around us, and there was nothing in my own 2 hands that could pry it open. That was when Tomas said quietly in the doorway, "Where is the Apache?" We hadn't seen him since the barn fell. And my first thought, God forgive me, my very first thought, the reflex of a small and frightened man, was he's gone. He saved himself and left us, the way they always said he would. I went to the window. I scraped at the frost with my thumbnail and put my eye to the little ragged hole I'd made. And out there in the killing white, coming down off the eastern rocks bent double against a wind that should have flattened a horse, dragging behind him a hide sledge piled high and lashed tight, was Esquilte. Coming back to us. I have spent years trying to understand why. I have my guesses. I'll give them to you before this is done. But in that moment I had no understanding at all, only the sight of him through a thumbnail hole in the frost, a man we had called a thief and a danger and a stranger, fighting his way through a storm that was trying to kill all of us, toward the house that held us, and not away from it. I threw open the door against the wind. The cold came in like a thrown axe. And Esquilte looked up at me out of a face crusted white, and he did not say "You're welcome," and he did not say "I told you so," though he had every right on God's earth to say both. He said, "Bring the men. There is more. We cannot carry it in one trip, and your daughter does not have to. Your daughter does not have to." He knew. Across 40 days of being treated like a coffin slot of a stranger, the man had still, somehow, been listening, had heard the cough, had counted my child among the things he was building against the dark. I will tell you the rest of it. What was on that sledge, and the trip we made up the mountain in the heart of the storm, and the thing he showed me inside that cave that was worth more than all the food in it. I'll tell you about the night the wind tried to put us under, and the choice that got made in the gold lamplight 12 feet inside a mountain, the choice that I have never told another living soul, the one that still wakes me. But I have to stop here a moment. My hand is tired, and the truth is I always have to stop here, at the open door, at the white face looking up, at the words your daughter does not have to. Because that is the moment I stopped being able to call him the Apache. That is the moment he got his name back. Escalte. I just didn't know yet what it had cost him to come down off that mountain and give it to me. We unloaded the sledge in the front room, and for a moment nobody spoke, because there are some kinds of mercy that take the words right out of a man. He had brought wood first. That was the thing that told me what kind of mind I was dealing with, not food, not blankets, wood, because Escalte had looked at our dead house and understood before he got to the door that a cold house kills slower than a hungry one, but it kills surer, and that a fever in a child's chest is a fire that needs an answer in kind. Split juniper and pinon, dry as old bone, the resin in it bright enough to smell. Dell, who had spent 2 months counting our hams against this man, got down on his knees at the cold hearth and built the fire with hands that shook, and when it caught, when that first real heat bloomed out into the room, old Dell put his face down near the flames, and I saw his shoulders go, just once, a single hard heave, and I looked away to give him the privacy of it. Then food, dried meat, dark and hard and honest, a sack of pinole, twists of dried mescal that I didn't know how to eat, and that Margit Peterson of all people recognized. She'd grown up further south, near people who lived closer to that knowledge, and she showed Adeline how to bruise it and steep it, and the smell of it cooking was strange and sweet, and is tied forever now in my memory to the sound of my daughter breathing in the next room. And there was a clay jar, stoppered with wax, that Escalte carried in himself and would not set down until he could put it in Adeline's hands directly. He said something low to her. I didn't hear all of it. I heard the end. For the chest, he said, steam, not to drink, to breathe. It was a thing he'd dried and ground from a plant I'd have walked past my whole life and called a weed. Adeline looked at it and looked at him, and there passed between those two, the grieving white woman and the iron-haired Apache man, we'd all decided to be afraid of, a single look that I have never been able to describe and have never stopped trying to. It was not gratitude exactly. It was recognition. Two people who had both stood in the doorway of the worst thing and come back out, recognizing the weather of it in each other's faces. She took the jar. She went to our girl, and within the hour the front room filled with a thin medicinal steam, and Junie's breath, for the first time in 2 days, found a little more room in it to move. I am not telling you the child was saved. We were a long way yet from saved. I'm telling you that for the first time since the sky went bruise-colored, there was a thing happening in my house that was not simply us losing. He meant to go back up the mountain that same night. I said no. I said it loud enough that Hutch flinched. There was full dark coming and a wind out there that had already knocked one barn flat, and the notion of this man, who had just dragged half a winter's salvation down a mountainside through a whiteout, turning around and going back into it, was more than I could stand. There is more, Escalte said, just that, patient like a man explaining the weather to a child. Enough for all, but not if it stays where it is. The storm is not finished. By morning the door may be under the snow, and then it is gone until spring, and spring is a long way for 11 people. Then it's gone, I said. We've got days now, days. We'll make a run at it when the wind drops. He looked at me with something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. The wind will not drop, he said. I have seen this storm before, not this one, its grandfather. And he picked up the empty sledge. So I went with him. I'll tell you why I went, and it wasn't courage. It was that I could not let the man go alone, not after the door had been thrown open and the fire was burning and my daughter was breathing easier on the strength of his foresight. There are debts a man can't carry sitting down by a warm hearth. I roped Tomás into it too, Tomás, who crossed himself 3 times and called me a name in Spanish that I deserved, and the 3 of us rigged ourselves to a guide rope and went out into the white. I will not pretend to describe that climb to you in any way that does it justice. The cold was a living thing with teeth. The snow did not fall so much as attack, sideways, relentless, finding the gap at every wrist and collar. There was no up or down out there, no horizon, no sky, only the rope in my fist and the dark shape of Esqueltet ahead of me moving through that chaos like he'd been born to it, never hurrying, never stopping, reading a country that had been erased. Tamaz went down once, slid into a drift up to his armpits, and it was Esqueltet who hauled him out, hand over fist on the rope, calm as a man pulling a bucket from a well. I heard Tamaz laughing when he came up, that high, cracked laugh men get when the alternative is screaming, and I heard Esqueltet say something to him, and Tamaz laughed harder, and I never did find out what was said, but I clung to that laughter like it was a second rope. Humor, out there in that. It was the most human sound in the world, and it kept my legs moving. The mountain rose. The cliff came out of the storm the way a face comes out of a dark room when your eyes adjust suddenly, all at once, there. And then the red slab and the juniper laid over the coffin slot of an entrance, frosted white now, nearly invisible. Esqueltet moved the brush aside. The gold of his lamp came up inside the rock. And we went into the mountain, and the storm shut behind us like a slammed door, and there was God, the silence of it. After hours of that screaming wind, the cave was so quiet I could hear my own heart, and the small steady drip of the seep into its clay basin and the hiss of the lamp. Warm, too, not warm like the fire, but warm like a held breath, the deep, even temper of a place the storm could not reach. 12 feet of mountain between us and the killing. I stood there dripping and gasping, and I looked at what this man had built. The second time now I'd seen it, but the first time I'd seen it clear, by lamplight, with my own life, and the lives of everyone I loved depending on what was stacked on those shelves. And I finally understood what I was looking at. It wasn't a larder. I'd thought of it as a larder the night I spied on him, a clever store of food. It was so much more than that, and the more was the thing that broke something open in me. It was a whole life set against death. There were the food and the wood, yes, but there was also a small store of medicines, dried and labeled in a script I couldn't read, each bundle tied a particular way so the hands could find the right one in the dark. There were tools, a spare knife, and all sinew fishhooks bent from God knows what. There were 2 pairs of mended moccasins in a child's size that stopped my heart when I saw them, because there was no child here. There was no child anywhere near this man, and I understood without being told that those small moccasins had been made for a particular pair of feet, and that those feet were not in the world anymore, and that he had made them all the same and put them on the shelf, and could not throw them away, and could not bear to look at them, so he had buried them in a mountain. There was a place at the back of the cave, swept clean, with a folded blanket and a smooth stone for a pillow, where a man could lie down, where a man had, I think, lain down, many evenings, alone, in the only place in all that country that was entirely his, that no one could take, that no soldier could burn and no rancher could run him off of and no winter could reach. He saw me looking at the moccasins. He didn't tell me to stop. He didn't gather them up. He just stood there with the lamp and the light moved on his face, and after a while Tamaz loaded the sledge behind us, blessedly noisy, blessedly busy, Esqueltet told me the thing he had never told anyone on the ranch. He told it plain, the way he said everything, laying the stones down one at a time. There were 9 of us, he said. When I was young, my mother's people, we wintered in a canyon to the south every year, the same canyon, because there was water and the cliffs broke the wind. He set the lamp down on a shelf. We kept our food in the open, in baskets on platforms where the animals could not reach. We had always done this. There was no reason to hide it. The land was ours and the food was ours, and we were not afraid. He was quiet a moment. The soldiers came in the cold time when they knew we could not move fast and could not run far. They did not need to kill us. They burned the food, the baskets, the platforms, the dried meat of a whole summer's work. They knew the cold would do the rest, that we would not survive the winter without it, that they did not need to spend a single bullet if they spent a single match. He looked at his own hands. I was 12. I watched the smoke. By the green time there were 4 of us. By the next cold time there was me. I had no words. There are times a man should not reach for words, and that was one. I just stood there in the warm gold dark and let him say it. So, Escalte said, and he gestured, a small movement of one hand that took in the whole cave, the shelves, the wood, the moccasins, the swept place at the back. So now I do not keep my food in the open. Now I do not let anyone see where it is. Now wherever I am before the leaves turn, I find a place in the rock, and I put away enough against the cold time, against the thing that everyone says is not coming. He picked the lamp back up. Everyone always says it is not coming. I have learned that this is the one thing you can be sure of, that they will say it is not coming, and that it comes. I want to stop the story here for just a moment, because this is the part the title gets wrong, or rather the part it can't hold. A blizzard proved him right. That's what they'd say afterward. That's how the story would travel down the years, made smooth and simple the way I warned you stories get. The Apache built a cave, and the blizzard proved him right. What foresight, what canny instinct. As though the cave were a clever bet that paid out, as though Escalte had been vindicated. But standing in that cave, I understood there was no part of this that felt like being right to him. He hadn't built it to be proven anything. He'd built it because a boy of 12 had watched the smoke rise off a winter's worth of food, and had grown into a man who could not, ever again, trust that anyone was coming, or that the warm season would last, or that the people around him would believe the cold was real until it was killing their children. He had built the cave the way another man might flinch from a raised hand 50 years after the blow. It wasn't foresight. It was a wound that had learned to feed people. Being right is a cold prize. I have been right about weather many times in my life, and it has never once made me glad, because to be right about the bad weather is to have seen the suffering before it came and been unable to stop it. Escalte had been right about this storm in the only way that mattered, which is that he had not waited for the rest of us to believe him. He had simply gone up the mountain, every evening alone, and made the answer ready and said nothing, and let us think what we thought. That, I have come to believe, is the loneliest form of love there is. To prepare a rescue for people who don't know they'll need it, who'd resent you if they saw you doing it, and to do it anyway, and to ask for nothing. We loaded the sledge until it could hold no more, and then we faced the part I have been dreading to write, which is the way down. The storm had gotten worse while we sheltered. I would not have believed there was a worse for it to get, but there was, and we walked out into it, and it took the lamp inside a minute, just snuffed it like a thumb on a candle, and we were 3 men and a loaded sledge roped together in a darkness so total and so violent it felt less like weather than like being swallowed. Going up, Escalte had read the country. Going down, there was no country left to read. We made it perhaps a third of the way before the thing happened that I have replayed 10,000 times. The slope steepened toward a draw we'd come up through, and the sledge, heavy now, got away from us on a sheet of wind-packed ice, and it took Tomaz with it. He was rear man. He had the brake line, and I heard him shout once, and then the rope between us snapped taut and tore through my mittened hands, and I went down and skidded and fetched up against a rock with the wind knocked clean out of me. When I could breathe and could see anything, which was almost nothing, Tomaz was gone over the lip of the draw, and the rope went over after him into the dark and the howling, and it was not moving. It was just hanging there limp, and there is a particular horror to a rope that should have a living man on the end of it hanging slack in your hands. Tomaz! I screamed it into the wind, and the wind took it and gave me nothing back. Escalte was already moving. He'd kept his feet, of course he had, and he came to me along the guide line and put his mouth right against my ear so I could hear him, and what he said was the thing that defines him for me, the whole man in 11 words. "You hold the rope," he said, "I will bring him up." And he took the slack line in both fists, and he went over the edge into the black draw after a man he had known for 2 months, a man who had crossed himself 3 times at the thought of going anywhere with him, a man who was not his people and not his blood, and not anything to him at all except cold and in trouble. and Escalte went into the dark after him without a half-second's hesitation, the same dark that had killed everyone he ever loved, and left me up top with the rope in my hands and the storm in my face and my whole heart in my throat. I held the rope, God knows I held it. I wrapped it around the rock and around my own body, and I held it while the wind tried to peel me off the mountain, and the rope jerked and jerked, and I could not tell if it was a man climbing or a man dying, and I held it, and I prayed in a way I had not prayed since I put my second son in the ground, which is to say, I did not ask God for anything. I just said the names of everyone I loved over and over into the storm like that was a kind of prayer, and maybe it is. And then there was weight on the rope. Real weight, climbing weight, hand over hand weight. And out of the lip of that draw came first Escalte's iron-gray head and then his shoulder and then, slung across that shoulder and gripped in one fist, Tamaz alive. His leg wrong below the knee, gray-faced but cursing, blessed be, cursing a streak that I could hear under the wind, which is how you know a man means to live. We got him onto the sledge. We lashed him to the load. And we went on down, slower now, Escalte hauling the brake himself, and somewhere in that endless black descent I stopped feeling my hands and my feet and most of my face, and I did not care, because all I could think over and over was, he went over the edge. He went into the dark, after us. We came into the lamplight of the house, like three men, risen from the dead. Adeline got the door. Margit and Hutch got Tamaz inside and onto the kitchen table, and Margit, who it turned out had set bones before, went white but went to work. Dell built the fire higher. Junie, and this is the thing I came into, the thing that buckled my knees worse than the cold, Junie was sitting up. Pale, wrung out, but sitting up, her breath clear enough that she could speak, and what she said when I came through the door crusted in ice and shaking was, "Papa, you're all snow," in a voice with air behind it, and I had to turn away and put my forehead against the cold door frame because a man can only be handed back so many people in one night. The steam had done its work, or the fever had broken on its own, or the warm house, or Adeline's hands, or Escalte's weed in the wax-stoppered jar, or all of it together, the way these things are always all of it together and you never know which thread to thank. It didn't matter. My girl was breathing. We had food now for 2 weeks, wood for one, a man with a broken leg on the kitchen table, and a man with iron hair sitting by the fire too tired to take his wet things off, just sitting there with the melt running off him. Staring into the flames, the way he must have stared into other flames a long time ago in a canyon to the south. I brought him dry things. I knelt down to help him and he let me, which surprised me, a small surrender, a man too spent to be alone in the way he was always alone. And as I worked the frozen lacing of his coat, I said the thing I had been carrying up and down that mountain. "We called you the Apache," I said. "All these months, I let them. And the word sorry was so small in my mouth, so cheap against what he'd done, that I couldn't make myself say it, and I just stopped." He was quiet a while. The fire popped. Tamaz groaned and swore on the table behind us. Then Escalte said his name. His own name the right way, slow, the middle of it catching in his throat the way I told you it caught. "Escalte," he said, "it is what my mother called me." He looked at me and the firelight was in his eyes and there was no anger in his face, which somehow was worse than anger would have been. "You may use it now. You have carried a rope for me. That is enough. You have carried a rope for me. That is enough. I have been forgiven things in my life. By my wife, by my God, by men I'd wronged. None of it ever landed in me the way those words landed, because none of it ever cost the forgiver anything to give. Escalte gave me his name across 2 months of being called a thief and a danger, and he gave it to me cheap, like it was nothing, like a rope held in a storm wiped a debt that I do not believe to this day was mine to have wiped. I have never told the rest of what happened that night to another soul. The choice that came after in the gold lamplight, when the storm settled into its long siege, and we understood that 2 weeks of food and 1 of wood was not going to be enough for 11 people in a 41-day winter, And Esqueltet laid out for us quietly the arithmetic of who could be kept alive on what, and we had to decide, all of us, awake at the kitchen table while the wind screamed, what we were willing to do, and to whom, and at what cost. To make 11 people last, where there was only food enough to be sure of 8. I'll tell you about that, I have to. It's the reason I started writing any of this down. But not tonight, my hand won't. Tonight I just want to stay here in this one warm room, with my daughter breathing and Tamaz cursing, and the fire that a stranger carried down a mountain, so that it could burn. And Esqueltet by the hearth, finally letting himself be still, finally letting himself be one of us, 11 souls in a storm, and not yet knowing, none of us yet knowing, what the next 2 weeks were going to ask. The arithmetic was the cruelest thing I have ever sat down in front of. We did it at the kitchen table the 4th night, after Tamaz's leg was splinted and the children were asleep in the warm, and the storm had stopped trying to break the house and settled instead into the long patient siege I'd come to understand it meant to be. Esqueltet laid it out. He used dried beans on the tabletop to do it, the way another man might use them to teach a child to count, and there was something terrible about watching salvation reckoned in beans by lamplight. So many people, so much food, even with the cave emptied into our pantry, so many days and no one could say how many because the storm had no bottom we could see. He moved the beans into piles. This pile is what we have. This pile is what 11 people need to not weaken. This pile is what 11 people need to not die, which is smaller, which is the pile of bare survival, the pile where you are cold and hungry and slow but your heart keeps going. Then he showed us the last sum, and he did it gently, and it was this. If the storm broke in 2 weeks, we would all of us live, lean and miserable but alive. If it ran 3 weeks, we would all of us be in trouble, but most would make it. If it ran longer, and the grandfather of this storm, he said, had run a moon and a half, then 11 was too many. The food would keep 8, maybe 9 if everyone gave up more than a body wants to give. Not 11. Nobody said anything for a long time. The fire ticked. Outside, the wind leaned on the walls. I want to tell you we were noble. We were not noble. We were 11 frightened people, and the first thing that happens in a room when there isn't enough is that everyone, in the secret animal back of their mind, begins to count themselves in. I caught myself doing it. I looked at my sick daughter and my grieving wife, and I felt my own arithmetic start up. Ugly and fast, Junie lives. Adeline lives, whatever it takes. And I was ashamed of it even as I couldn't stop it. And I looked up and saw the same shame moving across every face at that table. Earl Peterson with his 3 children. Dell, old and used up, who I could see doing the math and landing on himself as the bean to be taken off the table, and trying to be brave about it and not quite managing. And Esqueltet, watching all of us count. He had brought us the food. By any law of men that food was his. He'd grown it, gathered it, hauled it, hidden it, earned it across a lifetime of being given nothing. He could have kept the cave shut. He could have sat up there in the warm gold dark on his swept stone floor and let the 11 of us freeze, and no court in the territory and no God I believe in would have called it murder. He owed us nothing. We had called him a thief. Instead, he had emptied his life onto our shelves, and now he sat at our table and watched us, everyone, count ourselves into the lifeboat and count someone else out. He didn't shame us for it. That's the thing. He just watched, and when the silence had gone on long enough that everyone had finished their private ugly sums, he reached out and took 1 bean off the 11 pile and set it apart by itself, at the edge of the table. And we understood. No, I said. I said it before I decided to. It came up out of me. No, we don't do it that way. We don't, there's no, and I couldn't finish, because the truth was I didn't have that way to offer instead. I just knew with my whole body that I could not sit at my own table and let this man take himself off the count, again, the way the whole world had been taking him off the count his entire life. I am old, Esqueltet said, which was a lie. He was hale as any of us. I am alone. I have no children here. He looked at the lamp. When the soldiers came, I lived because the others chose to give me what they had. My mother gave me her share. My uncle gave me his. They are the reason I am sitting in this warm room 60 years later. A man does not get to keep a gift like that. He only gets to give it again. That's not, I started. It is exactly, he said, and for the first time there was something hard in his voice, not anger, but a thing harder than anger, a thing decided. You have a daughter who is just now breathing. You will not spend her food arguing with me about whether I am allowed to do the one thing my whole life has been pointed at. I have thought about that sentence for 30 years. The one thing my whole life has been pointed at. He had been a boy who survived because he was given to. He had become a man who put away food in secret all his days, against the cold time, against the burning, and I had thought up in the cave that he did it out of a wound, out of a flinch, out of fear. And he did. But that wasn't all of it. He did it so that someday, somewhere, when the cold came for people who hadn't believed it would, he would have something to give. He had spent his life getting ready to be the uncle, ready to be the one who hands his share across the fire to a child who isn't his, so that child can be breathing 60 years on, telling the story to someone who'll think it was about a cave. It was never about the cave. The cave was just where he kept the gift until the night came to give it. We did not let him do what he meant to do. I want that on the record because the story would be cleaner if we had, and I have come to distrust the clean version of everything. What we did instead was worse and better and more human. We pushed all the beans back into one pile and we agreed, 11 people, awake at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning while a storm tried to erase us, that we would all of us go hungry together, that no one would be taken off the count, that we would eat the survival ration and not one bite more, and that if the storm ran long enough to start killing us, it would have to kill us all the same, in the same order God or chance picked, and not in an order we chose at a table. It was not arithmetic. It was the opposite of arithmetic. It was the decision to be 11 or to be none. Esquelte didn't like it. He thought it was sentiment, and sentiment is a thing that gets people killed, and he was right, it might have. But Adeline, my quiet wife, who had buried 2 sons and not wept in front of anyone in years, Adeline put her hand flat on that table and said, "We are not going to teach my daughter that some people are beings," and that ended it. Even Esquelte had no answer to that. I saw something move behind his eyes when she said it. I think no one had told him in a very long time that he was not a being. So we starved together a little for the next 11 days. And then the storm broke. It broke the way these things break. Not all at once, not a triumph, just a morning where the wind had a different sound and Hutch went to the window and scraped the frost and said, in a voice gone strange, "I can see the ridge." We could see the ridge. The white was still everywhere and the cold was still murder, but the sky had let go of whatever it had been holding, and there was a hard blue scrap of it up over the eastern rocks, and somewhere out in all that ruined country, a single crow was complaining about something, the most beautiful ugly sound I ever heard. We had made it, lean as cats, all of us, and Tamaz would limp for the rest of his life, and we'd lost the barn and the horses, and the whole year's worth of cattle that I found in a frozen heap against the south fence when the snow finally let me reach them. But 11 people walked out of that house into the thin blue cold, and 11 people stood in the trampled yard and looked at a world made entirely new and entirely terrible and breathed it in. I went looking for Esquelte to say something. I didn't know what. There wasn't a what. He was up on the rise behind the house, where you could see the whole white sweep of the valley and the broken country folding away east toward the cave that had saved us. He stood there with that stillness of his, the iron hair, the deep pool quiet, and I came up beside him, and we didn't talk for a while, the way men who have been through a thing don't need to talk. Then he said, "I will go in the spring." I'd known it. I think I'd known it from the night he told me about the canyon. A man who keeps his food hidden in the rock because he cannot trust that anyone is staying, or that any place is safe. That man does not put down roots in a rancher's valley because the rancher learned too late to say his name right. "You don't have to," I said. "There's a place here for good, I mean it. After what there's a place." "I know you mean it," he said, and he almost smiled that almost smile. "That is why I can go." I didn't understand. He saw I didn't. "For a long time," Esquilte said, "I built the cave because I believed no one would ever carry a rope for me, that a man like me dies alone in the cold because that is what the world had shown me every time since I was 12. He looked out at the valley. "You carried a rope for me. Your wife told me I was not a bean. Your daughter is breathing." He was quiet. "I can go now, not because I am driven off. Because I have somewhere in here," and he touched his chest, once with the flat of his hand, the only time I ever saw him do it, to carry with me. A thing I did not have when I came down off that mountain. I will build other caves in other rock, but I will build them lighter now. I have turned that over my whole life, and I am still not sure I have the bottom of it. I will build them lighter now. I think he meant that a man can carry the habit of survival without carrying all the weight of the reason. That you can keep getting ready for the cold time without believing anymore that you'll meet it alone. I think we gave him that, the 11 of us, by being foolish and sentimental and refusing to turn anybody into a bean. I think it was the only thing we had that he needed, and we very nearly didn't have it. He left in April, when the passes opened. He wouldn't take a horse, though I offered, and he wouldn't take more food than he could carry, though Adeline tried to load him like a pack mule and got, for her trouble, the closest thing to a real laugh I ever heard out of him. He took his Springfield that he never pointed at anybody and a sack, and he shook my hand, which surprised me, a white man's gesture, given deliberately, a gift in its own small way, and he went to my daughter and knelt down to her height and said something to her quietly that she has never told me to this day and that I have never asked, because some things are hers and not mine. Then he walked east, up toward the broken country, and I watched him until the rocks took him, the way the rocks always took him, sideways into a fold of stone, there and then not there. The cave is still up there. I've never emptied it. I went up once, that first summer, and stood at the coffin slot of an entrance and moved the juniper aside, and the gold dark inside smelled of resin and dust and time. The shelves were bare where we'd taken from them, but the swept place at the back was still swept, and the smooth stone was still where his head had lain, and the 2 small mended moccasins in a child's size were still on the shelf where he'd left them. He didn't take them. I have thought a great deal about why a man would carry his whole hidden life into other rock and leave behind the one thing that was only grief, and the best I have come to is this. Maybe you can only set a thing like that down in a place where you finally believe it'll be safe. Maybe he left the moccasins with us the way his mother left her share of food with a boy of 12, not because he didn't want them, but because he'd found, at last, a place he could trust to keep them, a place that wouldn't burn. I left them where they were. I left all of it. Every fall since, before the leaves turn, I climb up there and I lay in a little wood, a little dried meat, a few good things in jars, against the cold time, against the thing that everyone always says is not coming. I tell the hands it's in case we get caught short. That's not why. People in the valley still tell the story. It's gotten smooth, the way I warned you. The Apache built a hidden cave to store supplies and the blizzard proved him right. They tell it like it's about cleverness. They tell it like it's about a wager that paid off. A man who was canny about the weather, and they shake their heads at the foresight of it, and not one of them says his name because the smooth version of the story doesn't have his name in it, and I have learned that you cannot put a name back into a story once the years have sanded it out. I've tried. They look at me funny. The Apache, they say, the one with the cave. So I keep the true version here, in the ledger in my own hand, where the years can't reach it. His name was Esquilte. It is what his mother called him. He carried his food into the rock all his life because the world had shown a boy of 12 that no one was coming. And then, one winter, when the cold came for a house full of people who hadn't believed it would, he came down off the mountain dragging the answer behind him, and he opened his hidden life onto our shelves, and he asked for nothing, and he gave a stranger back his own name for the price of a rope held in a storm. The blizzard didn't prove him right. The blizzard never proved anybody anything. The blizzard just came, the way he always knew it would. What the blizzard did was give him the one thing he'd been getting ready for, alone in the dark, for 60 years without knowing it. Somebody to give the gift to. I think about him every fall, when the light goes long and the first cold gets into the meat behind my ears. I wonder which rock he's in. I wonder if he ever did build them lighter. I wonder if anyone ever carried a rope for him again, or if that valley, that winter, those 11 foolish people who wouldn't turn a man into a bean. I wonder if that was the once. I hope it wasn't, but I built my own cave anyway, just in case. You never do know who's coming down the mountain, or who isn't.